What does it take to not just conquer an empire, but to make it a permanent part of your own bloodline? This is the story not of battles won, but of wombs controlled, not of cities burned, but of generations systematically rewritten. It begins not with a declaration of war, but with a mother's trembling hands. The spring air is warm, but her hands shake uncontrollably. She stands in a ragged line of women, watching as soldiers move with a purpose that is anything but random. They are Mongol officers, and their eyes are not filled with battle lust, but with a cold, appraising efficiency. 3 bodies away, her 14-year-old daughter stands, trying to make herself small, invisible, her eyes fixed on the ground. It doesn't work. An officer stops before her, lifts her chin with 2 gloved fingers, and turns her face left, then right, inspecting her like a farmer, assessing a new horse. He gives a single, curt nod. A scribe immediately steps forward, a parchment and inkpot in hand. He records her name, her age, a brief physical description. This is the bureaucracy of hell, and it is meticulous. The girl is pulled from the line. The mother lunges, a primal sound tearing from her throat, but a guard's arm blocks her, a wall of implacable force. She can only watch, helpless, as her daughter is shoved into a wagon with barred windows, one in a long, serpentine train of such wagons stretching into the distance behind the army. This is the last time she will ever see her child's face. This is not a scene from a dark fantasy. This is not an exaggeration. This is what the Mongol Empire perfected under Genghis Khan, a system of industrial-scale human processing with a singular, terrifying goal. While other conquerors like Alexander the Great sought the edge of the world, and Julius Caesar chased glory in stone and poetry, Genghis Khan pursued a different kind of immortality. He understood a fundamental truth that eluded his rivals. Battles are temporary, but genes are forever. He wasn't just building an empire of land. He was engineering an empire of blood, a biological invasion that would echo through centuries. His weapon wasn't just the mounted archer. It was the systematic control of reproduction, a chillingly precise strategy to convert conquered populations from the inside out. But to understand how such a monstrous system was born, you must first meet the boy who would become the Great Khan, a child forged in a crucible of betrayal and survival, where mercy was a death sentence. His name was Temujin, and his world was the vast, unforgiving Mongolian steppe. The year was 1162. Into a world where strength was the only god and weakness was a fatal disease, a boy was born. His very name, Temujin, was a scar from a recent victory, taken from a rival chieftain his father had just captured. From his first breath, his identity was stamped by violence. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, occupying a perilous middle ground in the brutal tribal hierarchy. He was important enough to be noticed, but not powerful enough to be truly feared, the most dangerous position of all. On the steppe, resources were everything, and they were desperately scarce. Pasturelands, water sources, and herds were constantly contested in a ruthless zero-sum game. Alliances were temporary, forged in convenience, and broken just as easily. A smile at a feast could hide the intent to poison, and today's sworn brother could be tomorrow's murderer. The young Temujin learned these lessons not from stories, but from the wary glances and calculated slights his family endured. He saw the barely concealed contempt in the eyes of other tribes, understanding that his family's safety hung by a thread. That thread was severed when Temujin was just 9 years old. His father attended a peace feast with the rival Tatars, a supposed truce between them. He ate their food, drank their wine, and accepted their smiles. It was a trap. Soon after, Yesugei was convulsing, vomiting blood, his body racked with the agony of poison. The young boy watched his father die, the light fading from his eyes, and learned the most brutal lesson of his life: trust no one. The betrayal did not end with murder. The clan elders gathered and delivered their verdict with cold, tribal logic. A dead chieftain was a liability. His widow, Holun, and her children were now mouths to feed without providing any military strength. They were cast out, abandoned to the merciless wilderness, their fate sealed. The message to Temujin was unequivocal. The moment you become weak, you become nothing. You are a burden to be discarded. This was the forge in which his character was tempered. This was the moment that either breaks a soul or hardens it into something unyielding. Watch what happens next, for this is where a monster is born, or perhaps where a brutal, world-shattering clarity is born from the ashes of absolute desperation. Ho-Lun, now a widow with several young children, led her family into the wild. Picture their existence, exposed to the elements, with no clan for protection, no guaranteed food or shelter, hunted by both man and beast. The Mongolian steppe is one of the harshest environments on Earth, with winters that plunge to 40 degrees below zero, and summers that offer no respite from a scorching sun. They became scavengers, eating roots dug from frozen ground with bare, bleeding hands. They set traps in icy streams for fish and caught rodents to eat raw when a fire might reveal their location to enemies. Every day was a lesson in survival, a test of taking what you could and defending it with your life. Ho-Lun taught her children which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Temujin's younger brother, Kasar, became a master archer out of sheer necessity. A missed shot meant an empty stomach for the family. Temujin himself learned to fight other desperate children for scraps, learning that hesitation meant starvation and that showing a moment of weakness was an invitation to be attacked. In this world, there was no room for compassion. Mercy was a luxury that only the secure could afford, and they had nothing. Every sunrise was a battle, and every sunset was a victory merely for having survived. The crucible of exile was forging a new and ruthless consciousness within Temujin. The boy who had watched his father die and his clan abandon him was learning that the steppe's law was absolute. Kill or be killed, take or be taken from. This abstract principle soon crystallized into a bloody, familial conflict that would define his character forever. The flashpoint was not a throne or a treasure, but something far more basic, a single fish. Temujin and Kasar had spent hours fishing in an icy stream, their success a rare boon for the starving family. Their half-brother, Begta, older and stronger, saw their catch and simply took it. This was not merely about hunger. It was a direct challenge to the fragile social order within their own exiled group. Begta was asserting his dominance, establishing that his strength gave him the right to their labor. For Temujin, this was an unforgivable violation of the only law he now respected. If he allowed this transgression to stand, he and his full brothers would be permanently subjugated, their survival threatened by a bully within their own camp. The two brothers, armed with their bows, stalked Begta to a hillside overlooking their makeshift camp. Begta saw them coming. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. Perhaps he still believed in the bonds of shared hardship, or perhaps he recognized the grim determination in their eyes and knew flight was useless. He sat down on the grass and made one simple, heartbreaking request. Do not kill me in front of our mother. It was a plea for a final shred of dignity, an acknowledgement that even in this brutal world, some lines should not be crossed. Temujin ignored it. He and Kasar drew their bows and shot Begta dead. The act was cold, calculated, and utterly decisive. It was not a crime of passion. It was a political execution within a family unit, a declaration that any challenge to his authority, no matter how small, would be met with lethal force. The principle was now cemented. Strength determines everything, and you cannot allow anyone to take from you without the most extreme consequences. When their mother, Ho-Lun, discovered what her sons had done, her rage was a tempest of grief and horror. She beat Temujin, her hands striking him until they were raw, screaming curses that would echo through history. She called him a mad dog, a destroyer of his own people, a monster that swallows its prey alive. You are like a lion that attacks its own shadow, she cried. You have no patience, no control, only rage. Her words were meant to shame him, to scourge his soul and bring him back from the brink of the savagery he was embracing. But for Temujin, her beating and her fury did not signal his error. They confirmed her weakness. In his eyes, she was still clinging to a sentimental, outdated code of family and mercy, a code that had left them starving and abandoned in the wilderness. Her morality was a luxury they could not afford. Her despair was proof that she did not understand the true, unforgiving nature of their world. The lesson he took from this was the opposite of what she intended. Sentiment would get you killed. Ruthlessness would keep you alive. This hardening of his soul was followed by years of dogged survival and cunning. Temujin's reputation as a fierce and determined survivor began to spread, but it also made him a target. The Taichiud clan, old rivals of his father, captured him and enslaved him, fitting a heavy wooden collar around his neck. A symbol of his subjugation, he was made to perform menial tasks, a constant reminder of his powerlessness. But Temujin was not broken. He bided his time, observing his captors, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came during a festival, when the Taichiud were distracted by celebration and drink. Seizing his chance, Temujin used the very wooden collar meant to humiliate him as a weapon, striking his guard and knocking him unconscious. He then fled into the darkness, a fugitive in the vast emptiness of the steppe, the weight of the collar, a constant burden as he ran. This experience taught him a complementary lesson to his earlier ruthlessness, the value of patience and opportunism. Sometimes, survival meant enduring humiliation until the perfect moment to strike presented itself. It was a lesson in strategic thinking that would later define his military genius. By the time he was 16, Temujin had clawed his way back to a semblance of status. He was no longer the abandoned urchin, but a young man of growing renown. He journeyed to the camp of his father's old ally, Day the Wise, to claim his childhood bride, Borte. This marriage was far more than a personal union. It was his first major strategic alliance, a tangible step toward rebuilding his father's lost legacy and securing a power base. Borte's father saw the fierce potential in the intense young man, a quality that could be harnessed and would be valuable. The marriage was finalized, and for a brief, hopeful period, it seemed Temujin had finally found a path out of the relentless struggle. He had something to lose again: a wife, a connection to a powerful clan, a future. Then, the past returned with a vengeance. The Merkits had a long memory and a blood debt to collect. Years earlier, Temujin's father, Yesuge, had stolen a woman named Holan Temujin's own mother from a Merkit warrior. In the steppe culture of perpetual vengeance, such grievances never expired. They only waited for the right moment to be settled. The Merkits saw that moment now. Temujin was established enough to be a meaningful target, but not yet strong enough to withstand a full-scale assault. They raided at dawn, a whirlwind of violence descending upon his camp. The air filled with the screams of his followers and the thunder of hooves. Temujin had mere seconds to react. The choice was stark: stand and fight against overwhelming odds, ensuring his own death and the permanent end of his lineage, or flee into the forest and live to fight another day. He chose survival. He mounted a horse and abandoned Borte and his camp to their fate. As he rode away, the sound of her screaming his name was a brand seared into his psyche, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had been tested again, and the cost of his survival was the woman who represented his entire future. The forest offered refuge, but no peace. For Temujin, the days and weeks that followed the Merkit raid were a special kind of torment. He was safe, but he was consumed by the knowledge of what he had left behind. The memory of Borte's desperate cry as he fled was a constant, echoing wound. He knew exactly what fate had befallen her because he understood the brutal customs of the steppe. A captured woman was not just a prisoner. She was a prize, a symbol of victory, and a tool for humiliation. Rumors, carried by traders and deserters, seeped into his forest hideout like poison. Each version of the story was a fresh dagger twist. Borte had been given as a wife to Chilja, the brother of the Merkit chieftain. She was being held as a concubine, subjected to repeated violation. She was pregnant. She had been traded further away to a distant tribe. She was dead, her body discarded as a message. Every possible scenario played out in his mind, each one reinforcing the same agonizing truth. He had failed. He had not been strong enough to protect what was his. For a young man whose entire identity was being built upon the principle of ruthless strength and control, this failure was psychologically intolerable. It was the defining wound of his life, the core insecurity that would fuel an empire's worth of ambition and vengeance. This period of helpless waiting, however, was not wasted. It was a time of grim mobilization. The shame and rage that festered within him became a catalyst. He began to reach out, to call in every possible favor, to leverage every connection. He went to his father's sworn brother, Ong Khan of the Karaite tribe, and appealed to their old alliance, presenting himself as a wronged son seeking justice. He also reforged his bond with Jamuka, a childhood Anda, or blood brother, who brought his own warriors to the cause. Temujin was no longer acting as a lone survivor. He was learning the art of coalition building, assembling a force not through birthright, but through persuasion, shared interest, and the promise of plunder. For months, he patiently gathered his strength, his singular focus fixed on one objective, the rescue of Borte. This campaign was personal, a crusade to reclaim his honor and erase the stain of his perceived weakness. When the raid finally came, it was swift and merciless. Temujin and his allies fell upon the Merkit camp with a fury born of calculated rage. The attack was a success. The Merkits were caught off guard and scattered. Amid the chaos of burning tents and clashing steel, Temujin searched frantically until he found Borte. The reunion was not the pure, triumphant moment he might have envisioned. She was there, alive, but she was visibly, undeniably pregnant. The physical evidence of her captivity was a fact that could not be ignored, a public testament to the violation she had endured and the time that had passed. Temujin, in a display of both personal feeling and political shrewdness, publicly claimed her as his wife and accepted the child she carried as his own. He gave the boy the name Jochi, which means the guest or the unexpected visitor. The name itself was a masterpiece of ambiguous diplomacy. It acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the birth without confirming or denying paternity. Yet, this ambiguity would hang over Jochi for his entire life, a cloud of suspicion that his brothers and rivals would never let him forget. The rescue was a military victory, but the aftermath provided Temujin with a far more valuable and dark strategic insight. As he surveyed the wreckage of the Merkit camp, he observed the different ways men and women processed the trauma of conquest. The Merkit warriors who had survived were psychologically shattered. In the honor-bound culture of the steppe, defeat in battle was the ultimate disgrace. Several of them, unable to live with the shame, took their own lives. Their will to resist had been broken along with their military power. The women, however, told a different story. Borte had survived. The other captured women had survived. They had endured unspeakable horrors, but they had adapted. They had done what was necessary to stay alive. And now, they would bear children. Temujin realized in that moment the profound, long-term power dynamic he was witnessing. A man killed in battle is simply removed. A city burned can be rebuilt, but a woman impregnated carries the future inside her. She becomes the vessel through which the conqueror's influence extends into the next generation. This was the genesis of his world-altering philosophy. Control the women of your enemies, and you don't just control the present, you command the future. You don't need to garrison every conquered village for eternity. You don't need to exterminate every last man. If you can ensure that the next generation is born of your blood, raised with your language and your customs, then the conquered people will become Mongol from the inside out. Their own children would be your most effective soldiers and administrators, their loyalty forged not by force alone, but by blood and upbringing. The uncertainty and internal strife that plagued Jochi could be weaponized on a massive scale to dismantle cultural cohesion and replace it with a new, hybrid identity loyal to the Mongol core. This was not a fleeting thought. It was a blueprint for permanent empire, refined in the fires of his own personal humiliation and loss. The systematic, industrial-scale use of sexual violence as a tool of state policy was born from Temujin's bitter experience on the Mongolian steppe, a direct response to the day he was forced to flee and leave Borte to her fate. The return of Borte and the birth of Jochi closed one chapter of personal vengeance, but it opened a new and terrifying volume on statecraft. Temujin's mind, sharpened by a lifetime of betrayal and survival, began to see the chaotic brutality of steppe warfare not as an end, but as an inefficient beginning. The raid and plunder model was wasteful. It created enemies who would forever seek revenge. His insight after the Merkit campaign was revolutionary. The true spoils of war were not the gold or the sheep, but the reproductive capacity of the conquered. A woman was a self-replicating resource. If a warrior took a sack of grain, it fed him for a week. If he took a woman and she bore a child, that child could become a warrior who would conquer for you for a lifetime, and whose children would do the same. This was an investment with perpetual returns. And so, as Temujin began his relentless campaign to unite the fractious Mongol tribes, he started to systematize what had always been done randomly. When he defeated a rival clan like the Tatars or the Taichud, he didn't just kill the men and let his warriors haphazardly claim women as personal prizes. He instituted a new protocol. All women of childbearing age were taken, every single one. This was a deliberate, sweeping harvest of human capital. This was where the bureaucratization of atrocity began. Temujin, now rising to be Genghis Khan, recognized that chaos was the enemy of efficiency. He began to distribute these captured women not merely as rewards for valor, but with strategic intent. Strong, healthy women were assigned to his most loyal and genetically robust warriors. Women from noble lineages were kept separate, their bloodlines seen as particularly valuable for producing future leaders. His closest advisors, men like his mother Ho-Lun, who had come to understand and perhaps reluctantly accept her son's ruthless pragmatism, and his shrewd generals, helped him track this human inventory. They started with simple records. Marks on parchment, tallies of how many women were taken, which warriors they were assigned to, and most crucially, which ones became pregnant. This was no longer just warfare. It was a grim experiment in forced population control. They were learning, through brutal trial and error, which tribal bloodlines mixed well, which women were most fertile, and how to maximize the yield of healthy, Mongol-looking children. The system was emerging not from mustache-twirling evil, but from a cold, administrative drive to optimize a process. By the time the scattered tribes of the steppe gathered at the Kurultai in 1206 and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the framework was firmly in place. The man who had murdered his own brother over a principle of dominance had now scaled that principle to an imperial doctrine. His closest administrators had a name for it, a term that laid bare its agricultural inspiration: the permanent seeding system. The language was chillingly deliberate. It framed women not as human beings, but as fertile ground to be sown with Mongol seed. This was not a hidden, shameful practice. It was a documented military protocol with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The goal was unambiguous: to ensure that every new generation across the empire would have a significant and growing proportion of Mongol blood, gradually diluting and eventually erasing the genetic and cultural identity of the conquered peoples. The first large-scale laboratory for this system would not be a Mongol rival, but a sophisticated, settled civilization, the Tangut Kingdom of Western Shire. In 1209, Genghis Khan turned his gaze south, towards the wealthy Tangut Kingdom. The Tanguts were a people of Tibetan origin who had built a formidable state, rich from Silk Road trade, protected by fortified cities and a professional army. They were accustomed to dealing with steppe raiders, bands of warriors who would swoop in, grab what they could, and retreat. They believed they knew what to expect from the Mongols. They were catastrophically wrong. The Mongol force that approached their borders was unlike any they had ever seen. Alongside the feared cavalry were elements that baffled Tangut scouts. Scribes carrying blank ledgers, census takers with detailed questionnaires, and doctors who specialized not in battlefield wounds, but in female anatomy and reproductive health. This was not a raiding party. It was a mobile processing plant. Before the first siege engine was even constructed, the Mongols' sophisticated intelligence network had already gone to work. Agents, posing as merchants or refugees, infiltrated Tangut cities. Their mission was not solely to map defenses, but to conduct a detailed census of the human resources. They compiled lists: how many women lived in each district, their ages, their physical descriptions, their marital status, the number of children they had already born, a crucial metric for proving fertility, and their social class. The Mongols were planning not a raid, but a harvest, and they were meticulously surveying the fields. When the first Tangut city fell, the terrifying efficiency of the permanent seeding system was unleashed. The population was separated with an assembly line precision that stripped away any illusion of chaotic plunder. Men were divided from women and children. Most of the men, seen as militarily dangerous and economically burdensome, were executed en masse within hours. Only a handful with vital skills, metalworkers, engineers, siege experts, were spared for slavery. Then came the categorization of the women. Teams of administrators, following their pre-compiled lists, moved through the terrified women. They were sorted into 3 groups. Primary reproducers were women aged roughly 14 to 30, healthy, with no visible deformities, preferably unmarried. These received a permanent ink mark on their left wrist, a unique identification number that linked them to the Mongol registry. They were the highest priority, assigned to the first caravans. Secondary reproducers were women from 31 to 40, particularly those who had already proven their fertility by having children. They received a different mark and were considered backup stock. Then there was the group classified as waste material: WIM, girls too young for immediate use, women deemed too old, and any who were sick or disabled. This group was led to the outskirts of the camp. What happened to them was rarely recorded in detail, but the administrative euphemism was clear: they did not return. The caravans that began to form behind the Mongol army were not a disorganized train of prisoners. They were a meticulously engineered logistics network, the physical manifestation of Genghis Khan's dark revelation, ready to transport its human cargo back to the heart of the emerging empire, where the next phase of the biological conquest would begin. The caravans that snaked their way north from the conquered Tangut cities were a terrifying innovation in the annals of warfare, mobile factories dedicated to the mass production of a new generation. These were not simple prison wagons. They were engineered with a specific, horrifying purpose. Built for durability over speed, their frames were reinforced to carry heavy human cargo across vast distances. The interiors were partitioned into compartments, much like stables for different types of livestock, each section serving a distinct function. One compartment held the newly captured women, those still in the initial, volatile stage of shock and resistance. They were kept under the strictest guard, their compartment designed to prevent communication and organization. Another section housed the women who had been confirmed pregnant, requiring monitoring but posing less flight risk due to their condition. A third held those who had recently given birth, now anchored by the vulnerability of a newborn. The darkest compartment was reserved for those who, after months of systematic impregnation efforts, had failed to conceive. These women, deemed unproductive, faced drastically higher mortality rates, as resources were ruthlessly allocated to more promising subjects. The wagons themselves were marvels of grim efficiency, with barred windows too small for escape, but allowing air circulation, because a dead woman was a wasted asset. Every detail, from the separate doors for each compartment to the heavy-duty wheels, was a testament to the cold, bureaucratic mindset that governed this system. Within this rolling city of suffering, the Mongol administrators operated with a chilling, clinical detachment. The women, once they passed through the initial categorization, lost their names. They became numbers, their identities permanently etched onto their wrists with tattooed digits learned from captured Chinese artisans. A woman was no longer a person. She was Unit 4,362 or Unit 7,691. Beneath this number were codes indicating her tribal origin, Tangut, Jin, Merkit, and her social class. Another code detailed her reproductive history: virgin, proven, fertile, number of previous births. This data was meticulously logged in massive ledgers that grew with every conquered city. Every single rape was documented. The woman's ID number, the date, the caravan and wagon number, and the identity of the Mongol warrior or guard involved. This grotesque record-keeping was not for accountability, but for genetic tracking. The administrators were attempting to understand which pairings produced the healthiest, most Mongol-looking offspring, treating human reproduction with the same methodical approach they applied to their famed horse breeding programs. In fact, many of the same officials managed both the imperial horse herds and the reproductive caravans, the bureaucratic language blurring the lines between animal husbandry and human atrocity. The pursuit of efficiency extended to a specialized medical corps that accompanied the caravans. These were not primitive shamans, but doctors trained in Chinese and Persian medical traditions, and their expertise was perverted to serve the system's goals. Their mission was to maximize pregnancy rates and ensure live births. They experimented with herbal concoctions derived from Chinese medicine, using plants known to affect fertility and induce superovulation, increasing the chances of twins or triplets. They implemented strict dietary protocols, discovering that certain nutritional balances improved conception chances and infant survival rates. They even performed crude surgical procedures to correct physical ailments that might prevent pregnancy, viewing a woman's reproductive system as a piece of machinery to be repaired for optimal function. When a pregnancy was confirmed, it was immediately registered. Doctors conducted regular checkups, not out of compassion, but because a miscarriage represented a catastrophic waste of months of investment. They needed to identify and address problems early. The entire process was a cold, calculated optimization of human biology, all in service of Genghis Khan's vision of a genetically transformed empire. The culmination of this nightmarish process was the birth itself, which was merely another stage in the production line. Birth attendants, often midwives captured from conquered cities and forced to cooperate under threat of death, managed the deliveries. The moment an infant was born, the clock started ticking. Within hours, Mongol officials would descend for the inspection. The baby was examined against a strict set of physical criteria designed to assess its potential for integration. They looked for Mongol traits, specific eye shapes, hair texture, skin tone, and facial bone structure. An infant who passed this ruthless quality control was separated from its mother within days, before any significant bonding could occur. These children were sent to Mongol families across the steppe to be raised as proper Mongols, speaking the language, worshipping the spirits, and knowing no other identity than that of the empire. They would become the next generation of warriors and mothers, utterly alienated from their origins. For the infants who failed the inspection, those deemed too foreign-looking, too clearly the product of a conquered people, the fate was swift and brutal. The administrative records coldly note their disposal as waste. The methods varied: exposure to the elements, smothering, or a quick blade. To the ledger keepers, this was not murder. It was the efficient culling of defective product, freeing up resources for more viable units. For the mothers, this moment was a psychological abyss. After enduring months of violation and the physical trial of childbirth, they were now confronted with the theft or destruction of their child. Some women shattered completely, retreating into a catatonic state where they had to be force-fed. The records clinically describe these women as unproductive due to mental deterioration, and they were soon eliminated. Others hardened, their despair crystallizing into a cold, fearless hatred that made them dangerous to the guards. But many learned to survive through a profound and tragic dissociation, mechanically going through the motions of existence while their inner selves retreated to some unreachable place. The Mongol administrators noted these women as acclimated and highly productive, completely missing the spiritual death that had occurred. This was the ultimate goal of the system, to break not just bodies, but souls, to erase the past and create a pliable, productive resource out of human beings. The caravans were a machine for unmaking people and remaking them into cogs for the Mongol imperial machine, a chilling testament to the fact that the greatest conquests are not of land, but of the human spirit itself. The fall of a city was not the end of the process, but merely the completion of its first, violent phase. As the dust settled over the smouldering ruins of Tangut and later Jin cities, the true machinery of the permanent seeding system swung into its most chillingly sophisticated operation, the management of the human harvest. The scale was staggering. In Zhongdu alone, the Jin capital that would later become Beijing, Mongol records coldly documented the capture of over 40,000 women of reproductive age. This was not a disorganized horde of prisoners. It was a meticulously logged population transfer. To manage this vast and traumatized human inventory, the Mongols developed a complex bureaucracy of atrocity, complete with specialized roles, each with its own set of grim protocols. The system had evolved from a brutal idea into a fully realized institution, a dark mirror of a civilized government, dedicated entirely to the business of forced reproduction. At the front lines of this operation were the capture squads. These were not ordinary warriors, but specialists trained for a specific task. During the chaotic final assault on a city, their job was to identify and secure the target demographic, healthy women between their early teens and late 30s. They were evaluated on their efficiency, how many quality units they could secure with minimal physical damage. They carried the ink and tools for the initial wrist markings, beginning the process of bureaucratic erasure before the women even left the city gates. Following them came the classification administrators. These were often older, experienced officials who could assess human value with the dispassionate eye of a livestock auctioneer. In under 2 minutes, they could examine a woman, checking her teeth for health, her posture for strength, her skin for disease, and assign her to the correct category, primary or secondary reproducer, or the doomed classification of waste material. Their decisions were final and dictated the entire future, or lack thereof, for the person standing before them. Once assigned to the caravans, the women entered the jurisdiction of the acclimation supervisors. This title was a monstrous euphemism for the officials in charge of the initial breaking period, the first few months of captivity designed to crush psychological resistance. These supervisors had, through gruesome trial and error, developed a repertoire of techniques to force compliance. Some women broke faster under total isolation, while others crumbled when grouped together, but prevented from forming supportive bonds. They discovered that occasional, unpredictable kindness from a guard could create a confusing trauma bond, making a woman more pliable. Their goal was not just physical control, but the systematic dismantling of the human will, creating a population of docile, productive units. Meanwhile, pregnancy monitors took over for the women who conceived. Their role was to manage the gestation period, identifying early signs of pregnancy through physical observation and applying herbal remedies to reduce morning sickness, not to alleviate suffering, but to ensure the mother retained enough nutrients to sustain the pregnancy. They knew how to position women in the wagons to minimize jostling and the risk of miscarriage. Every lost pregnancy was, in their ledgers, a failed production cycle. The most haunting roles were those that dealt with the system's inevitable byproducts. Birth attendants, typically captured midwives forced to work under duress, handled the deliveries. They brought life into the world under the watchful eyes of guards, only to immediately participate in the system's next brutal step, The darkest of all were the elimination crews. These men were the garbage disposal unit of the caravan network. They quietly disposed of the women who died from disease, suicide, or punishment. And most horrifically, they were responsible for the waste disposal of the infants who failed the post-birth inspection. The records note their work with a chilling, administrative brevity. Archaeological evidence along known caravan routes has since uncovered mass graves containing the commingled remains of young women and infants, a silent testament to the grim efficiency of these crews. This structured specialization, this division of labor in the service of atrocity, is what elevated Genghis Khan's system from mere savagery to something far more disturbing, a premeditated, industrialized process for reshaping humanity itself. Faced with this relentless machinery, the captured women were not passive victims. In the shadows of the wagons and the silence between the guards' patrols, a fierce and desperate resistance simmered. Human resilience forged its own weapons. Since overt rebellion meant certain death, the women developed sophisticated, covert methods of communication. A complex gesture language emerged. A particular way of folding the hands could signal knowledge of an escape route. A subtle scratch on the left ear meant a guard was watching. Whispers passed vital intelligence, which guards were careless after drinking, which stretches of the route passed near forests, which routes could be dug up and used to induce vomiting after forced meals. The most profound resistance was cultural. In whispered circles after dark, women would recite the names of their dead children, their murdered husbands, their lost villages. My son was Rashid, her daughter was Fatima. These names became acts of defiance, a refusal to let the system erase their pasts entirely. They hummed lullabies and wedding songs from their homelands, their melodies a fragile thread connecting them to an identity that the tattoos on their wrists sought to obliterate. This cultural preservation was a spiritual rebellion, but there were also active, physical acts of sabotage. Women learned to make themselves unproductive. They discovered which local herbs, when ingested secretly, could induce fever or cause miscarriage. They practiced techniques to discreetly vomit their food, slowly weakening themselves to a point of infertility without triggering fatal starvation. Some resorted to hidden self-mutilation, cutting their inner thighs or armpits to create infections that would render them temporarily or permanently unfit for pregnancy. The ultimate, most tragic act of resistance was infanticide. Some mothers, upon giving birth to a son, could not bear the thought of him being raised as a Mongol warrior who would one day inflict the same suffering they endured. In an act of desperate mercy and defiance, they would end their newborn's life. The risk was unimaginable, for the punishment for this act was designed to be a spectacle of such horrific, prolonged torture that it would sear the lesson into every other woman in the caravan. Yet, some still made that choice. These acts of resistance, from the whispered name to the final, desperate act, were a testament to a spirit that the bureaucratic machine could not entirely extinguish. They were fighting not for victory, which was impossible, but for the preservation of their very humanity in the face of a system designed to destroy it. The sprawling caravan network, a mobile city of sorrow stretching across thousands of kilometers, represented a logistical challenge on an unprecedented scale. To manage the hundreds of thousands of captured women, the Mongols had to create a support infrastructure that rivaled that of a medium-sized kingdom. This was no longer merely an army on the move. It was a forced migration engineered with cold, bureaucratic precision. Resupply stations were established at regular intervals along well-traveled routes, functioning like grim waypoints where food, water, and medical supplies were distributed with the same efficiency as they were to military units. Field hospitals, staffed by the same reproductive specialists who traveled with the caravans, dealt not with battle wounds, but with pregnancy complications, disease outbreaks, and the physical toll of systematic abuse. Their primary goal was to maintain the productive capacity of the human inventory. Classification centers sprung up at major crossroads, where new waves of captives from fresh conquests were processed, inked, and integrated into the existing system, their data added to the ever-growing imperial ledgers. The system even had its own dedicated morgue facilities for the elimination crews to dispose of the dead, ensuring that the stench of death did not spread disease and further impact productivity. This vast and horrifyingly efficient infrastructure was the physical manifestation of Genghis Khan's vision, proving that the permanent seeding system was not a side effect of conquest, but a central pillar of Mongol imperial strategy. By the time Genghis Khan turned his full attention to the colossal Jin Empire of northern China in 1211, the system was a well-oiled machine. The Jin were a formidable foe, ruling one of the most advanced and populous civilizations on Earth from their capital, Zhongdu. They possessed massive armies, sophisticated siege weaponry, and immense walled cities. By any conventional measure, the Mongols should have been outmatched. But the Mongols were not fighting a conventional war. Their campaign against the Jin was a full-scale deployment of the biological weapon they had been perfecting. City after city fell, and after the initial slaughter of men, the same meticulous process unfolded. The numbers became almost abstract in their enormity. Beyond the 40,000 from Zhongdu, records suggest that by 1213, over 100,000 women were being managed within the caravan network, a mobile population larger than most European cities of the era. The caravans themselves became a self-sustaining, nomadic society with its own brutal hierarchy and internal economy, a dystopian world moving in the shadow of the conquering army. It was during the subsequent invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 that the system reached its most terrifyingly refined form. The Khwarezmian Empire, spanning modern-day Iran and Central Asia, was a sophisticated Persianate culture, wealthy and powerful. Mongol intelligence operatives preceding the invasion conducted the most detailed demographic surveys yet. They didn't just count women, they mapped the very fabric of society. They identified emotional vulnerabilities which women had elderly parents or young children still free, which were newly married, which came from prestigious families where the shame of capture would be most acute. This information was weaponized. When cities like Bukhara and Samarkand fell, the separation of families was executed with psychological cruelty, designed to maximize despair and compliance. Mothers were deliberately kept with their young children for the first few weeks of captivity, leveraging their protective instincts to ensure docility. Then, after a precise period, just as hope began to flicker, they were torn apart. The destruction of this nascent hope was a calculated tactic to induce psychological collapse, making the women more manageable. The protocols also became more nuanced regarding social class. The Mongols had learned that not all genetic material was equal. Noble women received preferential treatment, better food, accommodation in tents rather than wagons, and were reserved for impregnation by high-ranking Mongol officers. This was not an act of chivalry. It was selective breeding. The offspring of noble bloodlines, raised with Mongol values, were seen as ideal future administrators, possessing the innate authority of their birth, combined with unshakable loyalty to the empire. Peasant women, in contrast, were valued for physical resilience and sheer volume, processed en masse with the goal of producing large numbers of sturdy soldiers and laborers. The system had evolved to appreciate the quality of its human stock, not just the quantity. The doctors, too, refined their dark arts, experimenting with herbal combinations to induce hyperovulation for multiple births, and perfecting dietary regimens to ensure healthier, more viable infants. The entire operation was a continuous exercise in optimization, a relentless drive to improve the yield and quality of the system's terrible output. The true, chilling legacy of this system, however, is not just recorded in the dusty ledgers of history, but is written in the very blood of millions of people alive today. Modern genetic science has provided irrefutable and staggering evidence of the permanent seeding system's success. Population geneticists have discovered a Y chromosome lineage that spread across Asia with breathtaking speed in the 13th century. This chromosome, carried by one single male ancestor, is now found in approximately 16 million men across the former Mongol Empire. That is 1 in every 200 men on the planet today. In certain regions of Central Asia, the frequency rises to over 8% of the male population. The geographic spread of this chromosome mirrors the borders of the Mongol Empire with uncanny precision. This is the genetic signature of Genghis Khan and his male lineage, a literal biological empire created through the systematic application of his policies. The countless sons born in the caravans, raised as Mongols, went on to father children of their own, carrying the legacy forward. The system did not die with its creator. His sons and grandsons, like Ögedei and Kublai Khan, continued and expanded the protocols during their invasions of Europe and the final conquest of Song China. The Mongols did not just leave behind stories of conquest. They left a permanent, biological mark on humanity, a silent, pervasive testament to the women whose bodies were the battlefield upon which this genetic conquest was won. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 did not mark the end of the reproductive caravans. In many ways, it signaled their full institutionalization. The system was no longer the personal project of a single ruthless visionary, but had become embedded state policy, a core tenet of Mongol imperial doctrine. During the chaotic succession, the caravan women were treated not as human beings, but as inheritable assets, redistributed among his sons and top generals like livestock or parcels of land. This period also saw one of the system's most cold-blooded acts of efficiency. Fearing that the political uncertainty might provide an opportunity for mass escapes, the new Mongol leadership ordered the execution of thousands of women deemed less valuable or too troublesome to control during the transition. Archaeological excavations near former caravan routes have uncovered mass graves from this era, containing the remains of women and children, their bodies disposed of with the same bureaucratic indifference that had governed their lives. The caravans, and the brutal logic that powered them, would roll on for generations, directed by Genghis Khan's successors as they pushed deeper into Europe, the Middle East, and southern China. The machine he built had achieved a terrifying autonomy, outliving its creator to continue its work of biological reshaping. This legacy forces a harrowing historical reckoning. How do we categorize such a system? From the Mongol administrative perspective, this was not evil. It was statecraft, the officials maintaining the ledgers, the doctors optimizing pregnancies, the guards enforcing order. They were serving their empire with impeccable efficiency. They were building a new world order, a Pax Mongolica, and the permanent seeding system was, in their eyes, a rational, if severe, tool for achieving permanent peace through demographic integration. This is the banality of evil manifest on an industrial scale. Atrocity committed not by raving monsters, but by functionaries focused on quotas, logistics, and procedural manuals. It is this chilling disconnect, the ability to compartmentalize unimaginable human suffering as a series of administrative problems, that makes the system so profoundly disturbing. It stands as a dark testament to how easily humanity can be reduced to data points when viewed through the lens of absolute power and utopian ambition. Yet, to view these women solely as victims of a vast, impersonal machine is to risk completing the erasure the Mongols began. They were, first and foremost, individuals whose worlds were violently destroyed. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and artisans. They had names, loves, and laughter before they became numbers. The archaeological record offers haunting, intimate glimpses of their resistance. In one burial site, researchers found the skeleton of a young woman with a small, hand-carved wooden bird hidden in the folds of her tattered clothing. It was a child's toy, a tangible piece of a life she refused to let go of. Another skeleton was discovered with faint, self-inflicted markings on her arm, a pattern that matched a clan symbol from a region 1,000 miles away, a silent, desperate effort to hold on to her identity. These are the fragile, human counterpoints to the cold, numerical entries in the Mongol ledgers. They remind us that history is not just the story of empires and systems, but of individual human hearts, each one a universe of loss and memory. The story of the caravans is not a relic of a barbaric past. It is a stark lesson in the ultimate logic of dehumanization. Whenever a group of people is systematically reclassified as less than human as units, stock, or seeds, the door is open to every conceivable horror. The Mongol system is perhaps the most extensive and chillingly premeditated example of this in human history. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, conquest, and the very meaning of humanity. Genghis Khan's true dark genius was his understanding that the most profound conquest is not of territory, but of the future itself. While other empires built on sand, erecting monuments that would crumble, he built on blood, weaving his genetic and cultural legacy directly into the fabric of dozens of populations. His monuments are not made of stone, but of flesh and bone, living on in millions of people who are unaware of the brutal origin of the DNA they carry. This history is a difficult, necessary memory. It is not a tale to be glorified, nor one to be ignored out of discomfort. It is a warning etched in the deepest layers of our shared human story. The women of the caravans have no grand tombs, no national holidays in their honor. Their names are lost to time, their individual stories swallowed by the scale of their suffering. But we, centuries removed, have a responsibility to remember the truth of what was done to them. We must listen to the silence they left behind and hear the whispers of their resistance, the hidden toys, the carved symbols, the whispered names in the dark. To acknowledge this history is to honor their stolen lives and to stand guard against the kind of thinking that made their suffering possible. It is the least we can do for the countless nameless who were processed, numbered, and erased in the relentless machinery of an empire that sought to conquer not just the world, but the very course of human heredity. The story of the caravan women does not end with the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire or the passing of centuries. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It is written in the very cells of millions of people alive today, a silent, biological echo of a brutal past. This enduring impact was revealed not by a historian's discovery of a new text, but by the cold, objective data of modern population genetics. In the early 2000s, a groundbreaking scientific study traced Y chromosomes passed exclusively from father to son across modern Asia. The results were staggering. Researchers discovered a single, distinct genetic lineage that exploded in frequency across the exact territories conquered by the Mongols, beginning in the 13th century. The origin point? The Mongolian steppe. The statistical analysis pointed to a single male ancestor from that period whose genetic signature is now carried by a staggering 16 million men, making him the most reproductively successful individual in all of human history. That man, by all geographical, historical, and genetic evidence, was Genghis Khan. This is the ultimate, chilling validation of the permanent seeding system's success. The systematic impregnation of countless women did not just produce a generation of soldiers. It created a biological dynasty that dominates the genetic landscape of Central Asia to this day. The empire built on blood, quite literally, still lives on within the bodies of his unknowing descendants. This genetic evidence forces us to re-evaluate what true historical success means. By the traditional metrics of power land conquered, wealth accumulated, enemies defeated, Genghis Khan was peerless. But his most lasting achievement, the one that has physically outlasted all his political and military accomplishments, was this demographic revolution. While the empires of Alexander the Great or Rome fractured and their cultural influence blended and faded, the Mongol genetic signature remains starkly clear. A direct line from the 13th century to the present. This was his true immortality, and it was achieved through the calculated, industrial-scale control of women's bodies. The system ensured that his lineage would not just rule for a century, but would become a permanent, major component of the human population across a vast swath of the globe. It is a sobering thought that one's ancestry can be a living artifact of one of history's most systematic and brutal campaigns of sexual violence. But this genetic legacy is also a profound injustice. It represents the ultimate triumph of the conqueror's narrative, the erasure of the vanquished in the most intimate way possible. For the 16 million men carrying this chromosome, their very existence is a product of that ancient system. Yet, the genetic story is overwhelmingly one-sided. It celebrates, however grimly, the male line. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, tells a vastly different and far more fragmented story. It speaks of countless diverse lineages from across Eurasia, Chinese, Persian, Tangut, Korean, that were funneled into the caravans and then submerged, their genetic identities diluted and lost within the overwhelming dominance of the paternal line. The system was designed to erase the mother's line, and genetically, it succeeded. The women, whose bodies bore the entire physical and emotional burden of this policy, are genetically invisible in this grand, male-centric legacy. Their contribution is the vessel, the landscape, but not the enduring signature. This is the final, cruel victory of the system. It made the world remember the seed, while the soil was forgotten. This history compels us to ask a difficult question. How do we, in the modern world, ethically engage with such a past? The romanticized image of the Mongols as noble steppe warriors, brilliant strategists who connected the East and West, is utterly incompatible with the reality of the reproductive caravans. To acknowledge this is not to dismiss their other achievements, but to insist on a complete and honest accounting. History is not a buffet where we select only the palatable parts. The Silk Road was paved by the same regime that engineered this system of mass rape. The cultural exchange happened alongside a deliberate campaign of genetic replacement. We must hold both truths simultaneously, recognizing that immense historical influence can be born from profound moral horror. This is the uncomfortable complexity of human history, where great leaps in connectivity and administration were funded by and built upon a foundation of systematic, industrial-scale human suffering. Remembering the caravan women is therefore an ethical imperative. They are the counter-narrative to the triumphant genetic story. They represent the millions of individual lives, hopes, and cultures that were extinguished to create the Khan's biological empire. Their story is a permanent warning about the ultimate endpoint of dehumanization, where human beings are reduced to reproductive metrics. In a world where technology increasingly gives us the power to manipulate biology and control life itself, the story of the Mongols' permanent seeding system stands as a dark lesson from the past. It shows us where the logic of efficiency without ethics, of power without compassion, can ultimately lead. It is a lesson written not in ink, but in blood and genes, and it is one we cannot afford to forget. The caravan women may be nameless in our history books, but their silence speaks volumes about the cost of empire and the enduring need to guard against the arrogance of absolute power. The scale of the caravan system forces a confrontation with a deeply unsettling reality. Its effectiveness relied not on the sadism of individual soldiers, but on the cool, detached logic of bureaucracy. The true horror lies in its normalization. The Mongol administrators who meticulously logged each rape, each pregnancy, and each birth were not frothing monsters. They were careerists, performing their duties with a focus on quotas and efficiency that would be familiar in any modern corporation. They solved logistical problems, how to transport hundreds of thousands of women across continents, how to maximize pregnancy rates, how to classify and process infants without ever confronting the human tragedy at the core of their work. This is the banality of evil on an epic scale. The system was designed to be operated by ordinary people following procedures, its moral vacuum filled with the dry language of inventory management and agricultural yield. The phrase waste disposal for the murder of infants and acclamation for the process of psychological breaking are testaments to this. The greatest atrocities in history are rarely committed solely by psychopaths. They are enabled by armies of functionaries who simply do their job divorcing their actions from their consequences. The Mongol reproductive machine is a primordial example of this chilling human capacity for compartmentalization. This bureaucratic legacy challenges the very way we narrate history. For centuries, the story of the Mongol Empire was told through the lens of its military conquests, its political structures, and its role in connecting East and West along the Silk Road. The caravan system and the systematic sexual violence it institutionalized was largely omitted, a dark secret whispered at the margins of the historical record. Yet, to ignore it is to tell a profoundly incomplete and sanitized story. It would be like chronicling the Industrial Revolution while ignoring the child laborers in the factories, or documenting the construction of the pyramids while erasing the slaves who built them. The genetic evidence now makes this omission impossible. The 16 million descendants are living proof that the story of the Mongol Empire is as much a story of controlled reproduction as it is of military might. Acknowledging this is not about applying modern morality to the past. It is about finally telling the whole unvarnished truth. The empire was built on two pillars, the mounted archer and the impregnated woman. To only remember the first is to participate in a centuries-long cover-up. The psychological impact of this system on the Mongol Empire's own society is another largely unexplored consequence. What does it do to a culture to be raised on the knowledge that a significant portion of its population are the children of systematically raped foreign women? The chronic suspicion that haunted Jochi, Genghis Khan's first son, was not an anomaly. It was a microcosm of a broader imperial anxiety. While publicly championing a unified Mongol identity, the empire was, at a genetic level, a vast, complex tapestry of assimilated peoples. This created a society where identity was both fiercely proclaimed and inherently fragile, where a person's loyalty could always be questioned based on the shape of their eyes or the rumor of their mother's origin. The very system designed to create unity through blood also sowed the seeds of internal distrust and ethnic stratification, problems that would plague the empire long after its founder's death. Furthermore, the caravan system fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of Eurasia in ways we are still understanding. It wasn't just the spread of the Y chromosome, it was the forced migration and blending of populations on an unprecedented scale. Women from China were brought to Central Asia, Persians to the Volga River, Alans to Mongolia. This brutal relocation was a form of ethnic engineering that destroyed countless unique local cultures and traditions, homogenizing populations under the Mongol yoke. While the Pax Mongolica did facilitate the exchange of goods and ideas, it also facilitated a coerced and traumatic exchange of people and genes. The vibrant diversity of the pre-Mongol steppe and its borderlands was irrevocably diminished, replaced by a new, imposed demographic reality. The caravans were not just vehicles of reproduction, they were instruments of cultural genocide, grinding distinct identities into a generic mass suitable for imperial administration. Finally, the story of the caravan women is not a closed chapter. It resonates with disturbing relevance in our modern world. The logic that drove the Mongol system, the dehumanization of a population for a political or ideological goal, is a recurring feature of human history. From the ethnic cleansing campaigns of the 20th century to the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war in contemporary conflicts, the same brutal principles are applied, albeit often with less bureaucratic sophistication. The Mongol Empire serves as the historical archetype, the first and most comprehensive case study of how sexual violence can be industrialized for state objectives. Understanding this system is not an academic exercise. It is a crucial tool for recognizing the patterns of atrocity in our own time. The caravan women were the first victims of a form of warfare that continues to destroy lives today. By remembering their story in all its grim detail, we arm ourselves with the knowledge to identify, condemn, and combat the same dehumanizing logic wherever and whenever it reappears. Their silence across the centuries is a call to vigilance, If the story of the caravan system were only one of top-down oppression, it would be monstrous enough. But to stop there would be to commit a second act of erasure against the women whose identities were already stolen. The human spirit, even in the face of a meticulously engineered hell, finds ways to resist. Within the rolling prisons, a secret world took shape, a shadow society built on silent communication and unbreakable bonds. Denied speech, the women developed a complex language of gestures. A particular way of tapping a finger against the wooden wall of a wagon could signal that a guard was asleep. A subtle tilt of the head might indicate that a fellow captive was in distress. They learned to read the slightest flicker of an eyelid, the almost imperceptible shift in posture, creating a silent network of support and intelligence that operated just beneath the notice of their captors. This was not a rebellion of swords and fire. It was a rebellion of whispers and glances, a defiant insistence on maintaining a shred of human connection in a world designed to isolate and shatter. This covert communication network became a lifeline for practical resistance. Information about the outside world, gleaned from careless guard chatter, was passed silently from wagon to wagon. Knowledge of the terrain, a nearby river, a dense forest the caravan would soon skirt was shared, fueling dreams of escape, however futile. Most importantly, they shared survival knowledge. Experienced women, often the midwives forced to attend births, would teach younger girls which foraged herbs could induce a fever or cause a miscarriage. They developed techniques to discreetly vomit their food after meals, slowly weakening themselves to a state of infertility without triggering a fatal starvation diagnosis from the monitors. Some became experts in self-harm, making tiny, infected cuts in hidden places like their inner thighs or armpits, a desperate gamble to render themselves temporarily unproductive and thus spared further impregnation. These were acts of profound courage, a daily war waged on their own bodies to reclaim a fragment of autonomy from the system that sought to reduce them to mere biology. The most profound and heartbreaking form of resistance was cultural and spiritual. The Mongols could tattoo numbers on their wrists, but they could not tattoo their memories. In the dark, when the guards' vigilance waned, the women would engage in secret rituals of remembrance. They would whisper their real names to each other, a defiant incantation against the numerical identities imposed upon them. "I am Altan of the Kerite," one would breathe. "I am Lin, daughter of a Jin scholar," another would reply. They created a living library of lost identities, each woman memorizing the names and origins of the others in her wagon, ensuring that if one perished, her story would not die with her. They hummed the lullabies their mothers had sung to them, the wedding songs from their villages, the funeral dirges for their murdered husbands. These melodies, carried on the night air of the steppe, were acts of spiritual warfare. They were a refusal to let their cultures be completely extinguished. They were building an invisible monument to the world they had lost, a monument made of memory and song. This cultural preservation extended to their children, in the brief, precious moments they were allowed. A mother, knowing her newborn would be taken within days, would whisper the child's true name into its ear, a name that connected it to a grandfather, a homeland, a history that had nothing to do with the Mongol Empire. She would hum the family's song, imprinting the melody on the infant's mind, a ghost of an inheritance it would never know. This was the ultimate act of hope, the belief that somehow, against all odds, a fragment of their true heritage might survive in a child raised to be their enemy. For the women who chose infanticide, the act was not one of despair, but of a terrible, merciful resistance. They chose to spare their sons from becoming instruments of the empire that had destroyed them, and their daughters from enduring their own fate. It was the final, most devastating way to assert control over the future the system was trying to forge from their bodies. The Mongols, in their bureaucratic obsession, documented the outcomes of these acts of resistance without understanding their meaning. Their ledgers note women who became unproductive due to self-induced infirmity or who were eliminated following acts of sabotage, but they missed the truth. These were not mechanical failures. They were declarations of war. Every whispered name, every hidden herb, every self-inflicted wound was a victory of the human will. The caravan system was designed to create a new Mongol reality, but within its heart, the old world stubbornly persisted, kept alive by the sheer, unyielding force of memory. The women understood they would likely die in those wagons, their names lost to official history, but in their silent networks, their whispered songs, and their desperate acts, they fought to ensure that the world the Mongols were building would forever be haunted by the ghosts of the worlds they had destroyed. Their resistance proves that even the most totalitarian system cannot completely eradicate the human need for identity, connection, and freedom. Their legacy is not just one of victimhood, but of an indomitable spirit that refused to be fully conquered. The sheer, continental scale of the caravan system raises a profound and unsettling question about historical memory. Why has this story, so central to the Mongol imperial project, remained for so long in the shadows? The answer lies in the very nature of the atrocity and the sources available to us. The Mongol Empire, for all its terrifying reach, was ultimately a pre-literate society on its steppe origins. Its most sensitive administrative records, including the detailed ledgers of the caravan system, were not meant for posterity. They were practical tools of statecraft, and many were likely destroyed during succession struggles or the empire's eventual fragmentation. The most explicit accounts we have often come from the pens of the conquered Persian, Chinese, and Arab scholars and historians who witnessed the aftermath. Their chronicles are filled with horrified descriptions of mass rape and enslavement, but they often lacked the internal, bureaucratic perspective that reveals the true, systematized nature of the horror. They saw the chaos of a fallen city, not the cold, clinical order of the classification centers and the meticulously managed caravans. This created a historical narrative that emphasized the violence of the conquest, but obscured the industrialized process that followed. Furthermore, the victims of this system were overwhelmingly women, the segment of society whose voices were most systematically silenced in historical records across all cultures. They did not write the chronicles. Their stories were not deemed worthy of official history. Their testimonies died with them in the wagons, their suffering recorded only as numerical entries in the Mongols' own grim account books, which themselves were largely lost. This created a perfect storm of historical invisibility. The perpetrators had no incentive to detail their most shameful policies for future generations, and the victims had no platform from which to bear witness. For centuries, the full story of the caravan system existed only as fragments, a shocking statistic in a Persian chronicle, a terrified poem from a Chinese survivor, and the silent, enduring evidence written in the genetic code of millions. It is only by piecing together these disparate sources, the archaeological, the genetic, and the historical, that the horrifying picture of a systematized, biological war finally comes into clear focus. This historical amnesia was also convenient for later generations. The romanticized image of the Mongols as brilliant, if brutal, strategists who opened up global trade routes fits more comfortably into a heroic narrative of world history. Acknowledging that the Pax Mongolica was built upon a foundation of industrial-scale sexual violence forces a moral reckoning that many have been unwilling to make. It is easier to focus on the movement of silk, technology, and ideas than to confront the movement of hundreds of thousands of raped women in reproductive caravans. This is not just an issue with Mongol history. It is a recurring pattern in how we record the past. The suffering of women, particularly sexual violence, has consistently been downplayed, omitted, or relegated to a footnote, treated as an unfortunate byproduct of war rather than a deliberate and calculated instrument of policy. The story of the caravan women challenges us to rewrite that narrative, to place their experience at the very center of our understanding of how the Mongol Empire actually functioned and what its true, lasting legacy entails. The ethical implications of this history extend far beyond academic debate, forcing us to confront the nature of Genghis Khan's legacy itself. Is he a great unifier, a visionary leader, and a military genius? Or is he the architect of one of the most comprehensive and chillingly effective systems of mass sexual violence in human history? The undeniable truth is that he is both. This is the uncomfortable, unresolvable paradox at the heart of his story. We cannot neatly separate the great conqueror from the monster who engineered the reproductive caravans. They are one and the same. His strategic genius was not limited to the battlefield. It was applied with equal coldness to the project of demographic engineering. To celebrate one aspect of his legacy while ignoring the other is intellectually dishonest and morally bankrupt. It requires us to accept that profound historical influence can be born from profound moral horror, and that the two are often inextricably linked. This duality forces a difficult conversation about how we memorialize the past. The 16 million men who carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome are a living monument to his success. But where is the monument to the millions of women whose bodies and children were the cost of that success? There are no grand tombs for them, no cities named in their honor. Their monument is this story itself, a story we have a responsibility to tell and retell. Remembering the caravan women is not about wallowing in the past's horrors. It is about correcting a historical wrong, about refusing to let their suffering be the forgotten price of an empire's glory. It is an act of bearing witness for those who could not bear witness for themselves. In a world where sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war, their story is not a relic, it is a warning. It shows us the ultimate logical endpoint of treating human beings as instruments of policy, and it reminds us that the greatest conquests in history are often stained with the most intimate and hidden of crimes. The silence of the caravan women across 8 centuries is a void that demands our voice. By speaking of them, we honor their stolen lives and affirm that their suffering matters, and that history must account for all its children, not just the victorious. The story of the caravan system does not conclude with the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. Its final, haunting chapter is being written today in the language of modern science. For centuries, the scale of this demographic engineering was a hidden history, inferred from fragmented chronicles and the sheer vastness of the Mongol conquests. But in the 21st century, population genetics provided irrefutable, physical proof. The groundbreaking study that identified the Y chromosomal lineage of Genghis Khan did more than just satisfy historical curiosity. It offered a quantitative measure of the system's terrifying success. The statistic 16 million direct male line descendants from a single 13th century origin is so staggering that it defies easy comprehension. To put it in perspective, this means that Genghis Khan, through his policies and those of his male heirs, has a direct paternal lineage that outnumbers the entire population of many modern European nations. This genetic footprint, spread from the Pacific coast of Asia to the edges of Europe, is the ultimate, silent testament to the caravan network. It is the biological empire he dreamed of, now mapped not on parchment, but in the DNA of millions of unsuspecting people. This genetic evidence forces a radical re-evaluation of the very definition of historical power and legacy. Traditional conquerors are remembered for the monuments they built, the laws they passed, or the territories they claimed. These are often transient. Stone erodes, laws are repealed, and borders shift. But Genghis Khan's most enduring monument is not made of stone. It is made of flesh and blood. His true legacy is not a ruined palace, but a living, breathing population that carries his direct genetic signature. This represents a form of immortality that transcends culture, politics, and even memory itself. Most of the men who carry this chromosome have no knowledge of their direct lineage to the Great Khan. They are living their lives completely unaware that they are the biological fulfillment of a 800-year-old imperial policy. This is the ultimate, chilling success of the permanent seeding system. It achieved its goal on a scale and with a permanence that its architects could scarcely have imagined, creating a legacy that is woven directly into the human species. However, this triumphant genetic narrative is also a story of profound erasure. The Y chromosome tells a starkly one-sided story, celebrating the unbroken male line. It renders the women of the caravans genetically invisible. Their immense contribution, the physical burden of pregnancy, the trauma of childbirth, the emotional agony of loss, is biologically silenced. Their diverse mitochondrial DNA, which tells the story of the mother's line, was diluted and submerged within the overwhelming flood of the paternal lineage. The system was designed to erase the mother's heritage, and on a genetic level, it succeeded spectacularly. This creates a disturbing asymmetry in how we understand this history through science. We can pinpoint the single male ancestor with breathtaking precision, but the millions of female ancestors remain a vast, anonymous collective, their individual genetic stories lost in the statistical noise. The science that proves the system's effectiveness also, tragically, replicates its core injustice by centering the conqueror and marginalizing the conquered. This leads to a complex and uncomfortable ethical dilemma for the modern descendants. What does it mean to carry the genetic marker of history's most prolific biological conqueror? For some in Mongolia, it is a source of immense pride, a tangible link to a glorious imperial past. For others, particularly those in regions that suffered heavily under Mongol rule, the knowledge can be a source of deep discomfort or even shame. This genetic legacy is not a simple fact. It is a loaded inheritance. It forces individuals to grapple with a past they did not choose, connecting them to both the grandeur and the horror of the Mongol Empire in the most intimate way possible. It makes personal what was once historical, forcing a confrontation with the fact that our own bodies can be living archives of ancient atrocities and triumphs. Ultimately, the caravan system and its genetic legacy stand as the ultimate warning about the long-term consequences of dehumanization. The Mongols did not see the women in their caravans as fully human. They were resources, units of production, a means to a demographic end. This philosophical stance, when combined with absolute power and bureaucratic efficiency, allowed for the creation of an atrocity on an industrial scale. The enduring lesson is that whenever we begin to classify people as less than human, whether by race, ethnicity, religion, or as mere instruments of state policy, we open the door to horrors that can echo for a millennium. The 16 million descendants are not just a symbol of Genghis Khan's power, they are a permanent reminder of the millions of women whose humanity was systematically stripped away to create it. Their story, now confirmed by science, teaches us that the greatest crimes are not always those that destroy lives in the moment, but those that seek to reshape the future itself by erasing the past and exploiting the most fundamental aspects of human life. It is a lesson written in our very genes, and one we must never forget. The sprawling, mobile city of suffering that was the caravan network required a logistical apparatus of staggering complexity, one that rivaled the supply lines of the main Mongol army. To manage hundreds of thousands of captives across thousands of kilometers, the Mongols established a grim infrastructure that functioned with chilling efficiency. Resupply stations were strategically placed along established routes, functioning not as places of refuge, but as grim pit stops where meager rations of water and food were distributed with the same calculated precision as fodder for horses. Field hospitals staffed by the reproductive specialists dealt not with battle wounds but with the medical consequences of the system itself: infections from unsanitary conditions, complications from childbirth, and the physical trauma of repeated assault. Their goal was purely utilitarian: to maintain the health of the productive population and minimize losses that would impact the system's output. Classification centers at major crossroads acted as bureaucratic hubs where new waves of captives from fresh conquests were processed, their data integrated into the ever-growing imperial ledgers. This vast and darkly sophisticated support network proves that the caravan system was not an ad hoc byproduct of war, but a premeditated, integral component of the Mongol imperial machine, funded and maintained with the same seriousness as any other branch of the state. This logistical reality forces a final, harrowing reckoning with the sheer scale of the human cost. While the genetic evidence points to the system's success, it tells us nothing of its catastrophic failure rate. The 16 million descendants represent the survivors, the successful outcomes of the Mongol demographic experiment. But for every child that survived to pass on that Y chromosome, how many mothers died in childbirth in the cramped, filthy wagons? How many infants were deemed waste and disposed of? How many women succumbed to disease, exposure, suicide, or the brutal punishments for resistance? The numbers are unknowable, but they must be magnitudes larger. If the system managed hundreds of thousands of women at any given time over decades, the total number who passed through it likely reached into the millions. The mortality rate within the caravans was undoubtedly horrific, a constant churn of human life where only the most resilient or the most broken survived long enough to be considered productive. This hidden holocaust, this mountain of unrecorded death, is the dark shadow behind the genetic success story, a testament to the system's ruthless efficiency in discarding what it deemed useless. The psychological impact of this system on the Mongol Empire's own society is a deeply underexplored consequence. The empire publicly championed a unified Mongol identity, yet it was actively creating a population where a significant portion were the children of systematically raped foreign women. This created a profound and pervasive social schizophrenia. While the official ideology preached purity and strength, the reality was a society built on a foundation of violent assimilation. The chronic suspicion and status anxiety that plagued Jochi, Genghis Khan's first son, was a microcosm of a broader imperial insecurity. A person's loyalty could always be subtly questioned based on their physical features, the rumor of their mother's origin, or the faint trace of an accent. The system, designed to create unity through blood, also sowed the seeds of internal stratification, distrust, and a fragile, contested identity that would haunt the empire long after its founder's death. The very method used to build the empire contained the psychological toxins that would contribute to its eventual fragmentation. Furthermore, the caravan system represents one of the earliest and most comprehensive examples of a recurring historical nightmare: the use of bureaucratic efficiency to administer atrocity. The Mongol administrators were not raving fanatics. They were clerks, doctors, and logisticians solving problems. They applied agricultural terms to human reproduction, optimized pregnancy rates, and managed logistics, all while maintaining detailed records. This disconnection between action and humanity, this banality of evil on an industrial scale, is perhaps the system's most chilling legacy. It demonstrates that the greatest horrors are not always committed in a frenzy of rage, but can be the cold, calculated output of a well-managed system operated by ordinary people who simply focus on their narrow tasks without considering the monstrous whole. This is a warning that resonates with terrifying relevance in our modern world, where technology and bureaucracy can be harnessed to dehumanize and destroy with ever greater efficiency. Finally, the story of the caravan women is not a closed chapter of a barbaric past. It is a foundational case study in a form of warfare that persists to this day. The systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of terror, ethnic cleansing, and demographic change remains a grim feature of modern conflicts, from Bosnia to Darfur to the ongoing atrocities committed by terrorist groups. The logic is the same: to destroy the social fabric of a community, to terrorize a population into submission, and to impose the conqueror's will on the most intimate level. The Mongol Empire simply industrialized this logic, scaling it to a level that is still difficult to comprehend. By understanding their system in all its horrifying detail, we arm ourselves with the historical perspective to recognize, condemn, and combat these same patterns wherever they appear. The caravan women were the first victims of a form of warfare that continues to destroy lives today. Their silence across 8 centuries is not an invitation to forget, but a compelling call to vigilance, a demand that we remember their suffering as a shield against the repetition of such horrors in our own time. Their story is the dark root of a poisonous tree that still bears bitter fruit, and remembering them is our first step toward tearing it out. If history is written by the victors, then the story of the caravan women represents a profound historical injustice, a narrative deliberately suppressed by the architects of the Mongol Empire and conveniently overlooked by centuries of historians who focused on military conquests and political achievements. The ledgers that reduced human beings to numerical entries were never meant for public record. They were the internal, operational documents of a state machine, and most were lost to time, discarded as irrelevant or destroyed during the empire's chaotic dissolution. The most vocal chroniclers of the age, Persian, Arab, and Chinese scholars, witnessed the aftermath of the horror, but often from a distance, their accounts focusing on the destruction of cities and the slaughter of men. They documented the chaos of the fall, but few had access to the chilling, bureaucratic order of the processing centers and the rolling caravans that followed. The full, systematized nature of the atrocity remained hidden, its scale too vast, its methodology too coldly clinical to be easily captured in the traditional chronicles of the time. For generations, the true story existed only in fragments, a whispered nightmare overshadowed by the grander narrative of Mongol unification and transcontinental exchange. This historical omission was not accidental. It was a function of power. The story of the caravan women is fundamentally a story about the systematic silencing of the female experience in history. Across cultures, women's voices have been marginalized, their sufferings considered a private, almost mundane consequence of war, rather than a matter of state policy worthy of detailed record. The Mongols themselves, in their bureaucratic language, erased the women's identities, replacing them with numbers and codes. This double erasure, first by their captors and then by the traditional focus of historical scholarship, has made the caravan women some of the most ghostly figures in the annals of empire. They are present everywhere in the genetic and archaeological record, yet absent from the grand narratives. Correcting this is not about revising history with a modern sensibility. It is about completing the historical picture, about insisting that the experiences of half of humanity, even and especially in their most brutalized form, are central to understanding the true cost of empire. The ethical weight of this history rests heavily on how we choose to engage with the figure of Genghis Khan today. He stands as one of history's most profound paradoxes, a visionary unifier and a military genius who was also the architect of a system of mass industrialized rape. These are not separate facets of his legacy. They are intrinsically linked. The same strategic mind that devised revolutionary cavalry tactics also conceived the permanent seeding system. The same will to power that forged a united steppe confederation also sanctioned the reduction of human beings to breeding stock. We cannot celebrate the former while ignoring the latter. To do so is to engage in a form of historical cherry-picking that sanitizes the past and dishonors the millions who suffered. Acknowledging this duality is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. It forces us to confront the unsettling truth that great historical influence can be born from profound moral horror, and that the engines of progress and connection are often lubricated with the blood and suffering of the invisible. This leads to the crucial question of memory and memorialization. Across the territories of the former Mongol Empire, statues of Genghis Khan stand tall, a testament to his enduring legacy as a national hero and a figure of immense historical importance. But where are the monuments to the caravan women? Where is the memorial to the millions whose lives were destroyed to fuel his biological empire? There are none. Their graves are unmarked, their names forgotten. Their only monument is the void they left behind, a silence that demands to be filled with our remembrance. Telling their story is an act of ethical resistance against historical erasure. It is our responsibility to build a memorial for them, not in stone, but in memory, to ensure that their suffering is acknowledged as an integral part of the story of the Mongol Empire, not a footnote to it. This is the debt we owe to the forgotten. Ultimately, the story of the caravan system is more than a dark chapter from the 13th century. It is a timeless lesson about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the human capacity for dehumanization. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity how easily human beings can be reclassified as resources, how love can be perverted into a tool of control, and how life itself can be weaponized. In an age of advancing biotechnology and pervasive surveillance, the lessons of the caravan system are more relevant than ever. The potential for states or powerful actors to manipulate human biology and control reproduction on a mass scale is no longer a medieval nightmare, but a looming ethical frontier. The story of the caravan women stands as a stark, historical warning. It shows us the abyss that opens when efficiency is divorced from ethics, when power is exercised without compassion, and when human beings are treated as means to an end. Their story is a plea from the past, urging us to vigilantly guard our humanity against the cold logic of systems that would seek to redefine it. By remembering them, we not only honor their stolen lives, but also fortify ourselves against the repetition of such horrors in whatever form they may take in the future. The story of the caravan women does not end with the dust of centuries settling over the Mongolian steppe. It echoes in the quiet hum of a modern genetics laboratory, and in the unsettling questions it forces us to ask about our own world. This history is not a relic, it is a mirror. The logic that powered the permanent seeding system, the reduction of human life to a manageable, exploitable resource, is a virus that has proven terrifyingly resilient. We see its mutated strains in the ethnic cleansing campaigns of the late 20th century, where mass rape was deliberately used to shatter communities and impose new demographic realities. We see it in the tactics of modern terrorist organizations that systematically enslave and violate women as a core tenet of their ideological war. The technology and bureaucracy may have evolved, but the foundational principle remains chillingly familiar. The human body, particularly the female body, can be one of the most effective battlefields for conquering a people. The Mongols were simply the first to industrialize this ancient horror, to apply a factory model to the destruction of the human spirit. By understanding their system in its full, monstrous detail, we are not just studying the past, we are learning to recognize the early warning signs of a particular kind of evil, one that wears the mask of efficiency and speaks the language of necessity. This history also compels a difficult conversation about the very nature of historical legacy. For generations, the narrative of the Mongol Empire has been dominated by its breathtaking military conquests and its role in forging connections across Eurasia. The Silk Road, the transmission of technologies, the Pax Mongolica, these are the chapters that have been emphasized, creating a vision of a brutal but ultimately world-changing force. The caravan system forces us to write a new, more honest ledger. We must now weigh the cultural and economic exchanges of the Silk Road against the forced, traumatic exchange of hundreds of thousands of women in the reproductive caravans. We must balance the administrative innovations of the empire against the innovation of a bureaucracy dedicated to mass rape. This is the uncomfortable, necessary math of history. It insists that the price of progress must be fully accounted for, and that the suffering of the anonymous and the powerless is as much a part of the historical record as the triumphs of the great and the powerful. To ignore this is to be complicit in a centuries-long cover-up. The genetic legacy, carried by 16 million men, presents a final, profound paradox. It is, on one hand, the ultimate symbol of the conqueror's victory, a biological empire that has outlasted all political structures. On the other hand, for the modern descendants, it is an invisible inheritance, a historical burden or point of pride that exists completely detached from their own identity and choices. This duality is at the heart of the ethical challenge this history poses. It reminds us that the past is not something that is safely behind us. It is inside us, shaping our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. The genes do not carry the memory of the trauma, the whispered names in the dark, or the mother's tear that fell on a newborn's face before it was taken. They carry only the mark of the conqueror. This is why the story must be told. The narrative is the necessary counterweight to the genetic data, the human context that gives meaning to the cold statistics. It is our responsibility to ensure that the silent testimony of the genes is paired with the spoken testimony of history, so that the full, tragic cost of this genetic empire is never forgotten. So, what do we do with this difficult knowledge? The answer is not to simply recoil in horror, but to actively remember. We must seek out and amplify the fragments of evidence that survive the archaeological finds of mass graves, the chilling entries in surviving ledgers, the terrified accounts in Persian and Chinese chronicles. We must support the work of historians and geneticists who are piecing this story together, giving voice to the voiceless. In our own conversations about history, we must refuse to sanitize the past. When the topic of the Mongol Empire arises, we must speak of the caravans with the same factual clarity as we speak of their cavalry tactics. This is how we build the memorial the caravan women were denied, not in marble or bronze, but in the unwavering commitment to truth. This journey into one of history's darkest chapters is now complete. We have followed the path from a mother's trembling hands to a genetic signature spanning continents, from the personal trauma of a single abandoned wife to a system of atrocity that defined an empire. This story was brought to you by Timeline Uncovered, a channel dedicated to unearthing the complex, unvarnished truths of our past. If history this profound and challenging matters to you, please help us continue this mission. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the events that shaped our world. We are deeply curious to know where these stories are being heard. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what other hidden histories you believe deserve to be uncovered. Your engagement is what makes this exploration possible. This isn't just entertainment, it's an act of collective memory. And memory, as we have seen, is the only defense we have against the repetition of history's greatest mistakes. Thank you for watching.